Okay, welcome folks. Today we are moving on to a new philosopher. We finished up with Locke, and now we're going to be spending some time with one of Locke's most interesting and arguably most important critics, and that's this figure right here, George Berkeley. Here's the plan for today. We're not going to be looking at Berkeley's most famous idea. We're going to be doing that in our next clip. Instead, we're going to be looking at Berkeley's criticisms of Locke's theory of general ideas or abstract ideas, as we'll sometimes see it referred to. So we're going to think about three objections that Berkeley is going to offer against Locke. And in the course of this, we're going to get a grip on Berkeley's alternative approach. We might call it a theory of generality, but without abstraction. And this is going to lead us to conclude with some final thoughts about the nature of language. It's typically been thought that in the history of philosophy, a special focus on the importance of thinking clearly about language was an early 20th century innovation with figures like Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein. But we'll see here in Berkeley that he maybe precedes some of these insights by pointing out that when we think about language in the right way, we will avoid certain epistemological and metaphysical problems. So let's get right to it. In our last clip, in our last session, we looked at Locke's theory of ideas. So whereas Descartes gave us a theory of ideas where important concepts are innate within us. So for instance, he says we have certain innate ideas, those of, say, God or extension or of maybe even the self. Locke is going to say, actually, these ideas are not innate, but we actually learn them all through experience. And we use this theory to explain how thinking works and how language works. So Locke points out that, look, our ability to talk about dogs is because the word dog triggers in us our idea of what's similar between a bunch of the dogs, right? So there are a bunch of particular dogs that exist, Fido and Spot, Rover, and even Bo, my dog right here. So we might say, look, when we're thinking about the term dog, we are thinking about, for instance, the qualities of dogs that are in each and every one of them. And the process that we're going through here is we learn to abstract from particular dogs down to what all the dogs share in common. So that's what's going on when we have an abstract idea of dogs. And Locke says, this is hard work. Having an abstract idea is not really a matter of simply moving through the world and having ideas impact you in the sense organs, but it is a longer process of reasoning that gets us from particulars to the abstract idea. Here's something that Locke says, in which Berkeley is going to quote Locke for saying, and he's going to go after what Locke is saying. General ideas are fictions and contrivances of the mind that carry difficulty with them. For example, does it not require some pains and skill to form the general idea of a triangle? For it must be neither oblique nor rectangle, neither equilateral, isosceles, nor scalene, but all of these at once. So, Locke is telling us basically that when we're thinking about the concept of triangle, you're thinking about triangles. And, he's going to say that your concept of triangle is neither equilateral, isosceles, nor scalene, right? So the equilateral has 3 equal sides. That's my best try at drawing an equilateral. Whereas the scalene is going to have 2 equal sides. So that's an example of a scalene. And then we can also think of, I believe that's the isosceles. Don't worry about the exact concepts, right? But we've got the isosceles, 2 equal sides, and then the scalene, which is going to have 3 sides of different lengths, right? Now he's going to say, well, what do we do when we form the general idea of triangles? Well, we say, that's one triangle, that's another triangle, that's another triangle, and we form the concept of what it is that each of these triangles share in common with one another. So we get this general idea of a triangle. And this is sort of a point that Berkeley is going to go after Locke for. When we talk about the general idea, or the abstract idea of the triangle, we're going to be thinking about triangularity in our minds, but it's going to be equilateral, isosceles, and scalene all at once, but none of them at the same time, right? So this is the picture of abstraction that Locke is giving us. Now, here's how Berkeley is going to push against it. His first criticism is simply that Berkeley himself looks into his own soul, looks into his own mind, and says, I myself cannot think of these so-called abstract ideas. So he says, I do not have in my mind the picture of a triangle that is equilateral, isosceles, and scalene all at once. He also points out, when we start thinking about abstraction, he's going to say, for instance, well, what you're supposed to do is, for instance, think about, say, a red square, and then you think about a red triangle, and you think about a red circle. One thing that Berkeley points out is that every time you try to think about redness, well, every time I try to put redness onto the screen, drawing with this little digital marker, well, I can't just draw nothing. Now, I could try to cover the entire screen with red, but if I were to do that, I'd still be giving the redness some kind of shape, right? So I've just made a very unique shape here that doesn't fit into geometry particularly well. But Berkeley is going to be pointing out that every time you try to think about the color red, it's going to be redness within space. And every time you think about redness within space, you're going to think about, for instance, a particular kind of shape, because shapes are just what emerge when you start thinking about things within space. Similar suggestion, it's impossible to think of motion without thinking of a body moving. All right, so how do you develop the concept of motion? Well, maybe you think about baseballs flying, and you might think about, this is my attempt at drawing a car moving down the road. Looks like I drew an SUV. We might think of this thing moving and that thing moving. You might think about the earth turning, or a coffee mug coming and moving up to my lips. But every time you think of motion, you have to think about a body moving. And when you think about motion separate from bodies, you're trying to imagine something that couldn't possibly exist. And the more you think about it, you might think that thinking about motion without some body moving is incoherent. So you have to think about specific particular colors in order to think about color, and you also have to think about these specific particular colors as within at least some kind of representational space, and specific movements in order to think about motion. So what's the big deal here? Berkeley is saying you cannot abstract away the concept of motion from particular motions. You cannot abstract away the concept of color without thinking about color as it's instantiated within space. Okay, here's the second critique of Locke that we find. One thing that we hear from Locke was that we need these notions of abstract ideas in order to explain human learning and human communication, right? The fact that I can meaningfully say the word dog and you are able to bring to mind the concept of furry four-legged friends, with wet noses and floppy ears and wagging tails. The fact that my utterance of the word is able to communicate a particular concept, dogs, not cats. Well, Locke is going to say these things are necessary to explain learning, but Berkeley is going to deny this. So Berkeley is going to tell us that abstract ideas are not needed to explain learning. So, whereas Locke is telling us basically that what puts us over and above animals in our ability to communicate and learn and do science is this capacity for abstract ideas, Berkeley suggests that most people get by just fine in the world, building houses or baking bread or even doing philosophy without thinking about abstract ideas. As Berkeley pointed out, he doesn't find any abstract ideas in himself, but he still does philosophy. Most people get by fine without such concepts. And here he's going to offer a different approach. He's going to say, it seems that a word becomes general by being made the sign, not of an abstract general idea, but of several particular ideas. So, if we think about the word dog, we might say what Locke thinks is going on is this is going to trigger an abstract general idea. So this very broad concept of what all the dogs share in common. But for Berkeley, he's going to say we use the dog just as a way of picking out particulars. So we might have one dog right here. We'll call this dog Bo, after my own actual dog. But then we might also have another dog named Sparky. And this dog named Sparky is going to be also picked out by the word. So it's this sort of like, look, we're just using the word dog as a sign to pick out a particular group of four-legged furry friends. So in this way, it would suggest that, look, when we're talking about how language works, we don't have to talk about this theory that Locke gives us of abstract ideas triggering an abstract general idea. It could just be that we use language as a way of sorting things together into certain groups. And once we've grouped things together, then we can use the word dog as a sign to pick certain particulars out. Here's another helpful line of thought. Berkeley tells us that a straight line drawn by a geometrician, that is a geometer, right, can be made general by being made the sign for all particular straight lines. So here's the thought. We might say, here's a claim that I might make about straight lines, that two parallel straight lines could run on forever and never intersect. So what I've done here is I've drawn a couple of straight lines. I flag that they're parallel, and then we imagine them continuing on forever, and we imagine that they never intersect with one another. So this is the idea that what we're doing when we think about this concept, we're not triggering general ideas, but we're thinking about, this particular line that I've drawn, which actually isn't perfectly straight, this one that I've drawn, which isn't actually perfectly straight. But we're saying that if we allowed these things to represent straight lines, we could start pointing things out about them, and then we can start making realizations that, well, for any kind of particular thing like this and that one, if they're really parallel and if they're really straight, then they will behave in certain ways. So what we're doing when we talk about straight lines is, well, oftentimes in geometry, we are using certain things as signs, representatives, guides in our thoughts, but we're actually thinking about particulars standing in for many, rather than using this concept of a general abstract idea. So, first criticism, it's hard to find abstract ideas in my own mind. Second criticism, we don't actually need them to explain learning and thought. And here's the third criticism. In fact, Locke's theory leads to inconsistencies. We might say that there's something incoherent about what Locke is doing. So Berkeley's going to tell us that it's utterly impossible to think about a triangle that's both isosceles and equilateral all at once. So here's the idea. Draw a triangle, right? So I'm going to draw a triangle here. You might say, well, it looks like this one is close enough to being, well, let's say it's actually not. It's not an equilateral triangle. It looks like these ones are close enough that I'm going to call them equal, but it seems like this side is shorter, right? So we're looking at that triangle, we are considering that triangle, but if we are considering it and as an isosceles triangle, then we're not considering it as an equilateral triangle. If we were to modify the triangle so it is actually perfectly equilateral, well, then we're thinking about a different triangle, right? So every time we try to make the triangle in our thoughts isosceles, it won't be equilateral. And every time we think about a triangle that is equilateral, we won't be thinking about an isosceles anymore. So in this way, when Locke told us that our idea of a triangle, our general abstract idea of a triangle, is all the kinds of triangle, but no kind of triangle all at once, well, that's just an unthinkable idea. We might think about it this way. Things that are truly incoherent, you can't actually think about them, right? So you cannot think about a shape which is a circle and which is a square at the same time, right? To be a circle rules out squareness. To be a square rules out circleness. And in this way, we might say that the idea of a square circle is so incoherent that you can't actually think about a thing that has all those properties. And the general abstract idea of a triangle is supposed to be equilateral and isosceles and scalene and right and, obtuse, like all these different triangle concepts. Well, not all of these concepts fit together, right? And if it couldn't possibly exist, it actually can't be a real object of consideration. So this gives us Berkeley's critique of Locke's theory of general abstract ideas. You might say Locke thinks that these are needed to explain human thought and learning and how we philosophize, but Berkeley is going to object, you can actually think about them, but we don't need them. So they are not thinkable, but thankfully they're not necessary. And the more you think about it, the more you realize that Locke is asking for something that is actually like really impossible to think about. How can you think about that triangle, which is isosceles, scalene, and equilateral? It's all of those and none of those at the same time. We might just ask Locke, I don't know how you could possibly think that I have these things in mind when I successfully understand the word triangle when you speak it. So, we'll sketch Berkeley's alternative approach. We already got a sense of it when we saw his suggestion that language isn't a trigger for general abstract ideas, but words are signs. So Locke seems to think that words bring ideas to mind. Ideas are simply the objects of thought. And these are going to be representations of certain kinds of things. But we can't have ideas representations of impossible things. So here's what Berkeley thinks is going on. When somebody says the word triangle, you don't think about triangularity in general, but you start thinking about particular triangles. So if somebody tells you that the internals, the angles of triangles add up to 180 degrees, you might, in your head, just think of any particular triangle. And maybe in this case, you've thought of what I'm going to draw as a right triangle. And you might realize that, well, if this is 90 of the degrees, then you're going to say this angle and that angle are going to add up to the next 90. They'll sum up to 180. And if you think about an equilateral, there's my best attempt at an equilateral. It's still a little off, but you see what I'm trying for here. We'll actually realize that these three internal angles, if this were really an equilateral triangle, would each be 60-degree angles. That's how they'd add up to 180 degrees, right? So when you hear the word triangle, you might think of a particular triangle, and you might ignore irrelevant features. So you might realize that, look, having three edges and three corners is necessary to being a triangle, but having a right angle in it is not necessary to being a triangle. So here's how Berkeley puts it. We may consider Peter insofar as he is a man, or insofar as he is an animal, but without framing the aforementioned abstract idea either of man or of animal. So we use the word man. We might say Peter is a man, and we understand that, we're thinking about the certain features of Peter that make Peter count as a man. Maybe nowadays we would say, Peter is a human being, Peter is an adult, and Peter identifies as a man. That might be one way of thinking about it this way. So sort of what we're going to think about is instead of treating our concepts as abstractions from particulars, here's how I like to think about Berkeley's way of thinking about concepts. Is you can think about a concept as more like a checklist of necessary features, right? So we might say, look, insofar as we're considering Peter as a man, Peter is going to have qualities A, B, and C, right? So here's my concept of a man. It's going to be a human, it's going to be an adult, and they are going to identify as a man. So we might say, that's the way that we might characterize the concept of manness. Now, what I haven't done is I haven't thought about what each and every particular man has in common, right? But what I have done is I've come to a realization about what we're talking about, what we're trying to pick out when we talk about people as being a man. But of course, we could categorize Peter as an animal instead. So we might say he's a living being, and that he does certain things that, say, plants don't do, right? So in this way, we might say, like, look, abstraction is not needed. Instead, we're using words as signs to indicate certain conceptual relationships between the particular and the concept. But the concept is not this sort of incoherent picture that might be in our head. I would say it's more like a checklist, or Berkeley is going to say that words fit together with definitions. So Berkeley is going to say that we're learning general truths about things like triangles, but we're not thinking about them in abstraction. And we think about particular individuals with a focus on specific qualities or aspects. And in this way, we might consider Peter as a man or an animal by thinking in terms of definitions. When we think in terms of a definition, what we're doing is we are sort of saying, like, look, here are the things that go into counting as this kind of thing or that kind of thing. It doesn't require an abstract picture, but it does require a recognition of certain necessary features of a thing. Now, I will note that this distinction between the definition and a general abstract idea is in fact a distinction that we've seen in some version already in this course. In Meditation 6, Descartes makes a distinction between imagining and understanding something. So he says, I can imagine a kiliagon, that is a 1,000-sided figure. I can also define a kiliagon. And I can actually have a much clearer definition of a kiliagon than a mental picture, because the mental picture of the kiliagon just looks like a circle, right? So we might say that our mental pictures of things, that is, our ideas, are often indistinct in a way that definitions are not. So even though Berkeley is considered to be somewhat of a rationalist, an empiricist, like Locke is. Locke and Berkeley are both empiricists. We can see Berkeley actually siding with Descartes' rationalist idea that we can get a better grip on things by thinking about definitions instead of thinking about mental images. Definitions can be much sharper and more distinct than our mental images. So, a final remark. The source of the problem with Locke's view, Berkeley thinks, is what he thinks of as the abuse of language. So he's going to say that the word triangle stands for many particulars rather than a general idea. And in this way, he's going to say that the word triangle does not have a precise signification. That is, there isn't an exact idea that goes along with the word triangle. Now, Locke is sometimes considered to be an advocate for a theory of language that many other philosophers find mistaken. And this theory of language is called psychologism. So, why is it called psychologism? Well, it's a view about language that makes the meanings of words psychological. I have an idea in my head and I want to get that idea into your head. So what I do is I utter a certain word that I think is going to trigger the same idea for you. So for instance, I could utter the word dog and hope that you have abstracted similar features out of the four-legged furry friends that I have in order to trigger that idea in you. So the idea for psychologism is the idea that meaningful words bring the speaker's ideas to mind for the hearer. But here's the problem. I could utter the word triangle, and the triangle that I have in my mind is a little red equilateral triangle. And when I utter that word, you're not going to think about general abstract triangularity, but you're going to think about a triangle. And we might say that, like, whereas I'm thinking about a little red equilateral triangle, you might be thinking about a big blue obtuse triangle. So this seems to be Berkeley's point. A definition doesn't have to have any determinate image associated with it. But this means that we can successfully define the word triangle without appeal to abstract ideas. If there were a definite image associated with the word triangle, then that would be consistent with Locke's theory. But the fact that I successfully communicate the word triangle to you, even though my idea is quite different than your idea, suggests that speaking meaningfully isn't about this psychological or psychologistic strategy of me bringing to mind the same image in my mind into yours, right? So Berkeley is going to see this as a reason to reject psychologism about language. Berkeley also has some rather ahead of his time remarks towards the end of the introduction of the principles, where he points out that sometimes with language, we're trying to do more than just get the ideas from my head into your head. So, for instance, he says, sometimes I use words not to get a matching idea from my head into yours, but instead I use it to evoke an emotion or spring you towards action. And in that way, Berkeley is going to say that the Lockean theory of language has misled us. Language is much more complex and subtle and variable than the psychologist, the psychologistic theory would have us believe. But we're going to wind up there. So this has been a summary of Berkeley's critique of Locke on abstract ideas. And next time around, we're going to look a little bit more closely at Berkeley's metaphysics and epistemology, where we'll find the strange idea that Berkeley is famous for. So thanks for listening in. As always, be well. And if you have any questions or concerns, please don't be shy about reaching out. Take care.